The morning sun rose gently over Lowe's angels, not with drama or spectacle, but with the kind of soft certainty that felt like a promise. Light slipped through the tall windows of Sandra Bullock's home, touching the wooden floor, warming the quiet air, moving slowly across framed photographs that told the story of a life lived both publicly and privately. Outside, the city was already stirring, but inside, the world felt paused, as if the day itself was holding its breath. Sandra sat near the window with both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her shoulders relaxed, her face thoughtful. She was not scrolling through messages or preparing for an interview. There were no stylists, no schedules taped to the wall, no assistants moving through the halls. This morning was different. This morning carried a feeling she could not fully explain, not excitement, not nostalgia, but something gentler, something like gratitude mixed with quiet anticipation. Today was not about films or promotions or public appearances. Today, she and Keanu were going somewhere that had nothing to do with spotlights and everything to do with presence. Her phone vibrated softly against the table. "I'll be there soon, are you ready?" The message was simple, no emojis, no extra words, and somehow that made it warmer. Sandra smiled. She had always admired that about Keanu. He never filled space just to hear himself speak. He never decorated emotions. When he said something, it mattered. When he showed up fully. She set the cup down and walked slowly to her room, choosing a soft blue dress, comfortable shoes, and a light sweater. Nothing glamorous, nothing staged, just herself. As she brushed her hair, her thoughts wandered to the invitation that had started all of this. Steve Harvey had called weeks earlier, his familiar voice full of humor and warmth. "Come spend a day with my family," he had said. "Not for cameras, not for shows, just food, stories, and real life. My wife's cooking, the kids running wild, old music, new memories, just people being people." Sandra had agreed before he even finished. And now that day had arrived. A gentle knock came at the door. Keanu Reeves stood on the porch, dressed simply, holding a small paper bag in one hand. The morning light rested on his shoulders, catching the lines of his jacket, softening the quiet kindness in his eyes. "You didn't have to bring anything," Sandra said, opening the door. He gave a small, almost shy smile. "It's nothing big, just something I've carried for a long time. Thought today might be a good day to let it go." The drive across the city unfolded in easy conversation and comfortable silence. Sandra spoke about her children, about how fast time was moving, about how moments were starting to feel more precious than milestones. Keanu listened the way he always did, not to reply, but to understand. When he spoke, it was never rushed. "Sometimes," he said quietly, watching the city pass, "life gets so loud that we forget how powerful quiet is." Sandra nodded, and how rare. When they arrived at Steve Harvey's home, the sound reached them before the sight did. Children laughing, a grill crackling, music drifting from somewhere in the backyard. It didn't feel like a celebrity's house. It felt like a family's. Marjorie Harvey opened the door with a wide smile that carried no performance, only warmth. "You made it," she said, pulling Sandra into a hug before greeting Keanu the same way. "They've been asking about you all morning." The backyard was alive. Kids were running across the grass, someone was chasing someone else with a water gun, and a group of relatives sat around a long wooden table already filling with food and conversation. Steve stepped forward, his voice booming, his arms wide. "Look who finally decided to bless my house," he said, laughing. "Come here." The hug he gave them was real, heavy with familiarity, free of image. Keanu placed the small bag gently on the table. Steve noticed immediately. "What you bring in, brother?" Keanu hesitated for half a breath. "Books, some old ones, stories about courage, kindness, believing in yourself. I carried them through a lot of years. Thought maybe your grandkids might want them more than I do now." The children crowded in. Small hands opened pages, eyes scanned pictures, voices started asking questions. Steve didn't joke this time. He looked at Keanu with something close to reverence. "Man," he said quietly, "you always show up to people's hearts before you show up to the room." Sandra watched the moment with a softness that surprised even her. She had seen red carpets, standing ovations, awards ceremonies. None of them felt like this. The afternoon unfolded the way real days do. Food was shared, stories were told. Laughter rose and faded and returned again. Sandra spoke about her early years, about auditions that ended in silence, about roles she didn't get, about nights she went home wondering if she had chosen the wrong dream. She spoke of resilience not as strength, but as choice, the decision to stand up again even when confidence is gone. Keanu spoke less, but when he did, the space changed. He spoke of loss without spectacle, of grief without drama, of the way pain does not make you smaller but deeper. Kindness, he said at one point, is what remains when everything else is taken away. Steve balanced the heaviness with humor, telling stories that made the children bend with laughter, reminding everyone that joy was not the opposite of pain, but its companion. And yet, not every face in the yard was bright. Sandra noticed him early. Jordan. Steve's teenage nephew sat on the edge of the gathering, shoulders curled inward, phone glowing in his hands, eyes distant. He laughed when someone spoke to him, but the laughter never reached his face. He didn't run with the younger kids. He didn't join the conversations. He was present but not included, even by himself. Sandra leaned toward Keanu. He looks like he's carrying something heavy. Keanu watched quietly. Some people carry storms so quietly that no one hears the thunder. He waited, then he stood. He didn't walk over with questions. He didn't approach with advice. He simply sat beside Jordan on the low garden wall, facing the same direction, looking out at the trees. Minutes passed. Then Jordan spoke, almost surprised by his own voice. I don't belong here. Keanu didn't turn. What makes you feel that way? Everyone's got something, Jordan said. Confidence, talent, plans, I don't, I'm just here. Keanu nodded slowly. Sometimes here is exactly where a story begins. Jordan glanced at him. What if I don't have one? Keanu finally looked at him, eyes calm, voice steady. Then today can be the first page. Sandra approached quietly, handing Jordan a glass of lemonade. You don't have to see yourself clearly yet, she said. Sometimes other people hold that vision for you until you're ready. Jordan said nothing, but he didn't look back at his phone. The sun began to soften, the air shifted, the day slowly turned golden. And somewhere between laughter and silence, between old stories and new connections, between the life they had lived and the one still unfolding, something unseen began to move, gently, deliberately, toward all of them. Something that would not leave when the day ended. Something that would test every word spoken and every kindness offered. Something that would turn an ordinary invitation into a night none of them would ever forget. The evening arrived the way meaningful evenings often do. Quietly at first, without announcement, without ceremony, as if the day wanted to make sure everyone was paying attention before it revealed what it had truly been building toward. The light in Steve Harvey's backyard began to soften and stretch, turning the grass into a deeper shade of green and the sky into a calm blend of peach and gold. The laughter didn't disappear, but it changed texture, becoming slower, warmer, less like noise, and more like music that belonged to the people who had created it. Sandra Bullock felt it in her chest, that gentle shift from daytime energy to something more intimate, the kind of atmosphere where people say things they didn't plan to say, where memories climb to the surface without being called. Steve's family moved around the backyard like a living rhythm. Marjorie checked on the food with a quiet confidence that didn't need attention to feel powerful. Someone carried trays, someone refilled drinks, someone called out a child's name with playful warning, and the children kept running as if the world would never grow dark again. Yet even as the evening glowed, Sandra noticed Jordan still hovering at the edge of belonging, no longer hidden behind his phone, but not fully stepping into the center either. It was as if he was standing at the doorway of a room he desperately wanted to enter, but something inside him kept whispering that he wasn't invited, even though everyone around him was making space without realizing it. Keanu stayed close, not in a protective way that made Jordan feel watched, but in a steady way that made him feel less alone. It was subtle. Keanu would glance at him when laughter rose, would nod when Jordan's eyes flickered toward the group, would speak to him without forcing conversation. Sandra recognized that kind of attention. It wasn't the attention of fame or performance. It was the attention that tells a person, I see you, without using the words. And Jordan, who had spent too long feeling invisible, began to respond to that language like a thirsty plant leaning toward light. When Marjorie called everyone to gather around the long wooden table outside, the atmosphere shifted again, becoming less scattered and more focused. Candles were lit, not for decoration but for warmth, and fresh flowers from the garden sat in small jars, simple and beautiful in a way that made the whole setting feel human instead of polished. The table was long enough to hold everyone, and somehow, despite the differences in age and life experience, the space felt equal. No one was above anyone here. The backyard didn't care about celebrity. The yard only cared about presence. Sandra sat beside Keanu, and after a brief hesitation, Jordan sat too, close enough to feel included, far enough to feel safe. Steve looked around with that familiar grin, but his eyes held something else, something deeper than entertainment. "All right," Steve announced, tapping his glass lightly like a man who had hosted 1,000 rooms and still knew when a moment deserved respect. "We're gonna do something tonight. Simple. Everybody here, you got a story. You got a lesson life taught you. Don't give me the Instagram version. Give me the real one lesson, one truth, something you learned the hard way or the beautiful way. We're family tonight, so let's talk like it." A ripple of laughter moved around the table, but it was nervous laughter, the kind people use when they're not sure how honest the room is willing to be. Marjorie went first, her voice calm and full, like a steady river. She spoke about patience, about how raising children wasn't about perfect days, but about staying present through imperfect ones, about how love wasn't proven by what you say, but by what you keep doing when you're tired. People nodded, smiling softly, because everyone at the table had lived that truth in one form or another. Then Sandra spoke, and the yard seemed to listen. She didn't speak as a celebrity. She spoke as a woman who had been young and uncertain once, as someone who had walked into rooms full of rejection and still found a way to keep walking. She talked about the years before success, the way doubt can feel like a shadow that follows you into every audition, into every decision, into every quiet night where you wonder if the world is telling you no because you're not meant for it. She explained that the strongest people she ever met weren't the ones who never failed, but the ones who kept returning to themselves after failure, the ones who refused to let rejection become identity. "Every no," she said, her voice soft but firm, "is not always a door closing. Sometimes it's the universe redirecting you toward the place you're meant to stand. And the hardest part is believing that while you're still in the hallway." When it was Keanu's turn, the table grew quieter, not because he demanded attention, but because his silence naturally gathered it. He took a moment before speaking, as if he wanted his words to be careful, as if he didn't want to waste the sincerity of the evening with anything unnecessary. Then he spoke about loss. Not in detail, not in a way that asked anyone to pity him, but in a way that honored the reality of what it means to carry grief and still choose gentleness. He said that pain can make people hard, can make them shut down, can make them protect themselves by withdrawing from love, but he had learned the opposite. He had learned that grief was a reminder that people matter, that time matters, that kindness matters more than pride. "When you lose someone," he said quietly, "you realize how much the smallest moment can matter, the way you speak to someone, the way you show up, the way you listen. Big gestures fade, but small kindness, it stays. It becomes the thing people remember when everything else becomes distant." Even Steve, who usually cracked a joke before a moment got too heavy, stayed still. His smile softened. His eyes flickered with something like recognition. "Man," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, "you don't talk much, but when you do, you hit people right in the soul." It was then, almost unexpectedly, that Jordan spoke. At first, it sounded like he didn't mean to, like the words slipped out before fear could stop them. But once he started, he didn't back away. His voice was quiet, but the yard didn't need volume to feel the weight of his truth. "Life taught me," he began, swallowing hard, "that you can sit in a room full of people who love you and still feel like nobody sees you." He paused, embarrassed, but no one laughed. No one interrupted. The adults at the table were suddenly listening with the kind of attention teenagers rarely receive. "I thought that was just how I was going to feel forever," he admitted. "But today I realized something. Even when you think you're invisible, someone notices, someone cares. And maybe you're not invisible. Maybe you just haven't found the place where you belong yet." Silence held the table for a breath. Then Steve leaned forward, his eyes shining with pride and surprise. He didn't turn Jordan's moment into a joke. He didn't steal the spotlight. He simply nodded as if he had been waiting a long time to hear those words. "That's my boy," he said softly, and the softness in his voice was the kind that made a person's chest ache. Marjorie reached over and squeezed Jordan's hand, and for the first time that evening, Jordan didn't pull away. He let himself be held by the moment. Dinner continued, but something had changed. The conversation became richer, more real, the kind of honesty that happens when one person opens a door and everyone else realizes it's safe to step through. Stories flowed like warm water, some funny, some painful, all of them human. Steve told stories about the early days when he was trying to make it, when he would leave auditions with empty pockets but still crack jokes because laughter was the only thing he could afford. Sandra laughed until she pressed a hand to her face, and Keanu smiled that rare full smile that made people feel like sunlight had appeared. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the night grew deeper, Steve stood up and disappeared inside for a moment. He came back holding a guitar like a man carrying a memory. "Now listen," he announced. "I am not a musician, don't let anybody tell you different, but tonight feels like one of those nights where you gotta put a little music in the air." He strummed awkwardly and everyone laughed. The children clapped anyway because children don't care about perfection, they care about joy. Marjorie leaned back, smiling like she had seen this 100 times and still loved it. Then to everyone's surprise, Sandra reached out gently. "Can I?" she asked. Steve blinked, offended in a playful way. "Hold on, why you askin' like you know what you're doing?" Sandra smiled and took the guitar, settling it against her lap with familiarity that made the family's eyes widen. She strummed softly at first, then found the chord again, letting it ring like a small confession. Her voice followed, not polished like a stage singer, not rehearsed like a performance, but honest and warm. She sang quietly, and the backyard seemed to lean in, as if the night itself didn't want to miss a note. Keanu sat beside her, watching without the need to speak. He wasn't impressed like an audience member. He looked proud like someone who had always known she carried hidden pieces of beauty. Jordan watched too, surprised by how music could make people feel connected without explanation. The children stopped running and gathered closer, their faces calm, their eyes wide in the candlelight. Even Steve sat down slowly, as if the song had gently forced him to remember something he hadn't thought about in years. And then, right in the middle of that softness, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the backyard went dim, the garden lights blinking like uncertain stars. A hush spread as if someone had pulled a blanket over the moment. The children stopped, confused. The music faded. The air cooled. A second later, the lights went out completely, leaving only candle flames and moonlight. A few kids gasped. Someone whispered, "What happened?" Marjorie immediately stood, calm but alert. Steve frowned, his shoulders tightening. Sandra looked toward the house, instinctively sensing the emotional shift in Steve even before he said anything. Steve tried to laugh it off at first. "Don't worry, y'all," he said, forcing humor into his voice. "Ain't nobody scared of a little darkness. This just means the universe wants us to look at each other's faces without all them fancy lights." But the truth was written on him. He was uneasy. His voice was too loud. His laugh didn't land. Sandra noticed the way his hands moved, restless. The way his gaze flickered toward the house like he was seeing something that wasn't there. Keanu stood up calmly. "I can check the fuse box," he said, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Jordan hesitated, then stood too. "I'll help," he offered, surprising himself. Keanu looked at him with quiet approval. "All right," he said, as if Jordan had been capable all along and Keanu was simply reminding him of it. "Come with me." They walked through the dark house together, using the flashlight from a kitchen drawer. The beam cut through shadows and revealed framed photos on the wall, family gatherings, graduations, laughing faces frozen in time. Jordan glanced at them as they passed, and something about those photos made the house feel even more alive in the darkness, like love had been planted into the walls. "This is weird," Jordan admitted softly. "It feels scary." Keanu stopped for a second, turning the light gently toward Jordan's face without blinding him. "Fear is normal," he said. "But fear doesn't mean you're weak, it means you care. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to move anyway." The fuse box was in a back room. Keanu crouched down, checking switches with patience, while Jordan held the light steady like a partner, not a burden. It was a small moment, almost nothing, but Jordan felt something unfamiliar, usefulness. The feeling of being part of the solution instead of part of the background. Keanu reset a switch, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy and suspenseful. Then the lights flickered and came back. A cheer erupted from outside as the yard lights returned, and the children clapped as if Keanu and Jordan had brought back the sun itself. Steve shouted dramatically, "Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the hero team!" And laughter returned. But this time it wasn't just laughter, it was relief. And for Jordan, it was something even more precious. He had mattered. When they returned to the table, Jordan sat taller. His face held a quiet pride he didn't know how to wear yet, but it was there. Sandra smiled at him like she had witnessed something sacred. Keanu sat down beside him for a moment, his voice low. You did good. Jordan swallowed. I just held the flashlight. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Yeah, he said softly, and without that I'm just a guy guessing in the dark. The warmth of that statement settled into Jordan like medicine. That was when Steve's mood shifted again, this time not from fear, but from a seriousness that made the entire table quiet without him asking. He leaned forward, elbows on the wood, eyes reflecting candlelight, voice lower than the one people knew from television. Since the power went out, he said slowly, I need to tell y'all something I don't talk about much. The family quieted. Even the children, sensing the gravity, grew still. Steve exhaled like he had been holding this story for years. Everybody knows me as the funny guy, he said. Big voice, big jokes, big energy. But before all of this, before TV and success and suits and microphones, there was a time my family had nothing. We were so poor we didn't know if dinner was gonna show up. And I remember one night, just like tonight, the power went out. His voice trembled slightly and the backyard didn't laugh this time. It listened. I sat in the dark, Steve continued, and I remember thinking maybe this is what my life is always gonna be. Darkness, and then a neighbor knocked on our door, an older man, worn clothes, tired eyes, but he had a lamp in one hand and a warm meal in the other, and he said something I never forgot. Steve swallowed, looking down for a second, then up again. He said, darkness doesn't last forever, but light only grows when you share it. Sandra's eyes filled. Keanu lowered his gaze with respect. Jordan felt his chest tighten, not from sadness alone, but from the strange feeling of being connected to a story older than his own pain. Steve's hand rested on the table, steadying himself. That night changed me, he said. I promised myself if I ever made it, I would be that neighbor for someone else. I would bring light to people when they needed it. He looked directly at Jordan. And tonight, Steve said, voice thick with emotion, when I saw you stand up and walk into that dark house to help, I saw myself, and it reminded me of that promise. Jordan's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. He didn't even know he deserved that kind of recognition. But Marjorie reached over, touched his shoulder, and whispered, You're not invisible, baby. You never were. And just as that moment settled into something that felt like closure, the world decided they weren't done yet. A knock echoed from the front door. Not a casual knock. A steady, urgent knock, the kind that doesn't belong to midnight. Marjorie's face changed. Steve stood up instantly. The children's eyes widened. Sandra's heart jumped the way it does when instinct tells you something is about to happen that you cannot control. Steve held up a hand. Stay here, he said, voice cautious. Keanu rose immediately. I'll come with you. They walked through the house together, footsteps muffled, the warm backyard glow fading behind them as they moved toward the front door. Steve opened it slowly. An older man stood outside. His clothes were worn. His posture carried years. His eyes were tired but kind, the kind of eyes that had seen hardship but refused to become cruel. In his hand, he held a small envelope, aged and slightly bent, like it had been carried for a long time. I'm sorry for coming so late, the man said softly, but I've been searching for this family for a long time. Steve's face hardened with confusion, then softened with curiosity, then froze with something like recognition. The man extended the envelope. Steve took it, fingers trembling. He opened it carefully, as if the paper might break. Inside was a faded letter written decades ago. Steve's eyes moved across the first line, and his lips parted as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Then he whispered the words aloud, voice cracking under the weight of time. To the boy I once gave a lamp to, may you never forget that light is meant to be shared. Behind him, the backyard seemed to stop existing. Inside the house, time itself felt like it had paused. And Steve Harvey, who had spent his life making millions laugh, stood at his own doorway like a child again, staring at a past he never expected to see with his own eyes. The stranger waited quietly. Keanu stood still beside Steve, calm but alert. Sandra and Marjorie, hearing the tension, began moving toward the door, their faces filled with concern. And Jordan, who had just begun to believe he mattered, felt something deep shift again, like life was about to test their promise in a way none of them could predict. Because sometimes the most important moments of a special day don't happen when you plan them. They happen when the past shows up uninvited. They happen when kindness returns in human form. They happen when the light you thought was gone knocks on your door. Steve Harvey stood frozen at the doorway, the envelope still open in his hand, the faded paper trembling between his fingers as if the words themselves were alive. The stranger remained quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect, the way a man waits when he knows the moment belongs to someone else. The porch light illuminated his face just enough to show the long road written into his features, the years of carrying something that had never truly left him. Keanu stood beside Steve without a word, his presence steady, grounding, as if silently reminding him that he was not standing in that doorway alone. Sandra and Marjorie had reached the hallway, their faces filled with concern and curiosity, and Jordan followed close behind them, his heart beating fast, not from fear but from a strange anticipation he could not name. Steve finally lifted his eyes from the letter and looked at the man. His voice came out lower than anyone had ever heard it. Are you the neighbor?" he asked. "The one from when I was a kid?" The man nodded slowly. "My name is Franklin," he said. "I live 2 doors down from your old house. You were a thin boy back then, big eyes, always laughing even when you were hungry. I never forgot you. I didn't know if you'd remember me, but I remembered you." Steve inhaled sharply, the breath catching in his chest. For a moment, the world he knew, the studios, the lights, the applause, seemed very far away. All he could see was the memory of a dark living room, a single lamp, and a warm meal carried by hands that had nothing to spare but gave anyway. He stepped forward suddenly and wrapped his arms around the old man, holding him like a son who had found a father he never thought he'd see again. The man stiffened for only a second, surprised, then slowly returned the embrace, his thin arms closing around Steve with a tenderness that did not need explanation. Sandra covered her mouth, emotion rising without permission. Marjorie's hand pressed to her chest as tears filled her eyes. Jordan watched in silence, something ancient and powerful unfolding in front of him, something he felt even if he didn't yet fully understand. "Come inside," Steve said, his voice breaking but strong. "Please, my family needs to meet you. They need to know the man who gave us light when we had none." He guided Mr. Franklin into the house, and when they stepped back into the backyard, conversation fell away as if someone had turned down the volume of the world. Faces lifted, bodies stilled. The moment announced itself without words. Steve stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on Mr. Franklin's shoulder, the other still holding the faded letter. "Family," he said quietly, and the way he said that one word made it clear he meant more than blood. "This is the man I told you about, the man who knocked on our door when I was a boy, the man who brought a lamp and a meal into a house that had nothing but darkness. This is the man who gave me the first picture of what kindness looks like." No one rushed forward. No one filled the space with noise. Respect wrapped around the table like a warm blanket. Marjorie stepped closer and took Mr. Franklin's hand in both of hers. "You have no idea what your kindness became," she said softly. "You helped build the man standing here." Mr. Franklin shook his head gently. "I didn't build him," he replied. "I only showed him a door. He chose to walk through it." His gaze shifted, landing on Jordan, who had been watching with wide eyes. "And it looks like someone else is standing at a door tonight, too." Jordan stiffened, not in fear but in recognition. Steve guided Mr. Franklin to a seat at the table, placing him in the center without ceremony, as if the place had been waiting for him. When everyone sat again, the night felt different, heavier, deeper, as if the backyard had become something sacred without ever needing to say so. Steve poured a glass of water for Mr. Franklin with his own hands. "Tell them," he said quietly. "Tell them what happened after that night. I've told your story for years without knowing your name." Mr. Franklin wrapped his hands around the glass, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. "There's not much to tell," he said after a moment. "Life didn't suddenly become easy. My wife got sick not long after that. Most of what I had went to medicine. When she passed, I moved where I could find work. I didn't build a big life. I built a simple one, but I never stopped believing what I believed that night, that what little light you have becomes more powerful when you share it. I didn't know if you became anyone. I only hoped you became okay." Steve let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob at the same time. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "I became more than okay, and tonight you let me finally say thank you." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "Sometimes the people who change us the most never see the result. Tonight you're giving all of us a gift." Mr. Franklin looked at him carefully. "And you," he said, "you carry quiet pain, but you also carry light. I've watched your life from far away. You remind people the world can still be gentle. That matters more than fame." Keanu lowered his gaze, humbled, not knowing how to answer something so true. The table slowly came alive again, not with laughter yet, but with stories. People spoke of moments that had shaped them, of teachers who had believed in them, of strangers who had shown up once and changed everything. Even the children listened, leaning into their parents, sensing that this night was different. Jordan sat very still, the words "every act of light returns" echoing again and again in his mind. He looked at Mr. Franklin, then at Steve, then at Keanu, and something in him began rearranging itself, like furniture being moved inside a room he had lived in too long without change. Steve eventually unfolded something else from the envelope, another piece of paper that made him inhale sharply. It was a photograph, faded at the edges, showing his childhood home lit from inside by a small lamp. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Every act of light returns." He passed it around the table. Each person held it differently. Sandra traced the edge like it was fragile history. Marjorie pressed it flat against her palm. When it reached Jordan, he held it longer than anyone else, staring at the words until they felt like they were speaking directly to him. "I didn't think small things mattered," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But this traveled decades." Mr. Franklin smiled. "Small things are the only things that travel that far." The night deepened, but no one moved. The candles burned lower. The sky filled with stars. The family felt suspended in something that didn't belong to clocks. Steve finally spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "I want us to promise something," he said. "Right here, not the kind of promise you post, the kind you live, that we don't keep the light, that we pass it every chance we get." One by one, they nodded. Voices murmured agreement. When Jordan placed his hand over the photograph, something inside him felt like it was waking up for the first time. Then from somewhere beyond the front gate, a sharp cry cut through the quiet. Not laughter, not a shout. A cry. Everyone froze. The sound came again, clearer this time, urgent and breaking. Steve was already standing. Keanu moved at the same moment. Sandra's heart leapt into her throat. Jordan felt the words of the promise echo in his head like a challenge. They reached the driveway to see a car pulled to the side of the road, headlights still on, door open. A woman stood beside it, panic etched into every movement. In her arms was a young boy, no older than 8, his face pale, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Please," the woman cried, her voice cracking. "Someone help me. My son can't breathe. The car broke down. I don't know what to do." The world shifted instantly. The sacredness of memory gave way to the urgency of now. Steve moved toward her, his voice loud but controlled. "We're here. We got you. We're going to help." Sandra reached for the woman's shaking hand. "You're not alone," she said firmly. "We're here." Keanu dropped to one knee in front of the boy, speaking softly, calmly, as if his voice itself could create oxygen. "Hey, buddy, look at me. Stay with me. Try to breathe slowly with me." Jordan stood frozen for half a second, fear racing through him until another feeling rose stronger, purpose. He stepped forward. "I'll come," he said, his voice trembling but real. "I can help." Keanu looked up at him, eyes steady. "All right," he said, "then you're with me." Steve's car was already being pulled around. They moved quickly, gently placing the boy in the back seat with his mother. Keanu sat beside him, Jordan on the other side, taking the boy's small hand in his own without hesitation. Steve drove, his jaw set, his hands firm on the wheel. The night rushed past the windows in streaks of light and shadow. Inside the car, the boy struggled for breath. His mother sobbed quietly, whispering his name again and again like a prayer. Jordan leaned closer. "You're not alone," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "I see you. You're going to be okay." The words surprised him as they left his mouth. He didn't know where they came from. He only knew they were true. Keanu watched him from the corner of his eye, something like pride softening his features. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Doors opened, voices called. A nurse rushed them inside. They waited under harsh lights that hummed softly overhead, time stretching into something heavy and strange. Jordan couldn't sit. He paced, rubbing his hands together, heart pounding. Steve stood with his arms crossed, praying silently. Keanu sat still, eyes closed, centered. The woman stared at the floor, empty. Then a doctor appeared. "He's stable," he said gently. "We're running tests, but he's breathing. He's going to be okay." The relief hit like a wave. The mother collapsed into tears, hugging Steve, then Keanu, then Jordan, gripping him as if he had been the last rope holding her above water. "Thank you," she cried. "I don't know how to thank you." Jordan shook his head, tears in his own eyes. "You don't have to," he whispered. Just hold him." The ride back was quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of something having been answered. Steve finally spoke. "Tonight," he said slowly, "we didn't just talk about carrying the light, we did it." Jordan looked out the window at the stars. "I thought I was invisible," he said, "but tonight I was." When they returned, the family rushed to meet them. When they heard what had happened, Marjorie pulled Jordan into a long embrace. Mr. Franklin watched from his chair, eyes shining. "You see," he said softly, "the light doesn't wait until you're older or braver or wiser. It only waits for you to choose it." Jordan nodded, tears slipping free. "I didn't know if I could," he said, "but I did." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and warm. "That's how it begins," he said. "One choice, then another." The night had not ended. It had only deepened. And something in all of them knew the final hours before sunrise still had more to give. The house was quieter when they returned, but it was not the kind of quiet that feels empty. It was the quiet that follows something meaningful, when hearts are full and words are slow to return. The Harvey family gathered once more around the long wooden table. The candles now burned low, their flames small but steady, like tiny witnesses that had refused to leave their posts. The night air was cooler, carrying with it the distant sounds of Lowe's angels settling into sleep. But inside the circle of light in the backyard, something felt awake in a way none of them would forget. Steve stood at the head of the table again, but he no longer looked like the host of a gathering. He looked like a man who had walked through memory, through fear, and through purpose all in the same night. "Family," he said quietly, "I don't think any of us planned for what tonight became, but I think this night planned for us." His eyes moved from face to face, resting on Marjorie, on Sandra, on Keanu, on Mr. Franklin, and finally on Jordan. "We talked about light. We talked about kindness. And then life turned around and asked us if we meant it." No one interrupted. The children who had once been full of restless energy now sat close to their parents, drowsy but alert, sensing that something sacred was still unfolding. Marjorie reached across the table and gently took Jordan's hand, holding it the way a mother holds a child's hand when she wants them to remember the moment forever. "Tonight," she said softly, "you didn't just help someone, you showed us who you are becoming." Jordan's throat tightened. He had spent years not knowing who he was at all. Now the question felt less frightening. It felt open. Keanu leaned back slightly, his eyes calm, reflective. "What happened tonight," he said, "is what I've learned life is really about. Pain is real. Loss is real, fear is real, but kindness is real too. And every time you choose it, you change the direction of something. Sometimes you never see how far that change goes. Tonight, we saw it." Sandra nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "And we felt it," she added. "Not on a stage, not through a screen, but here with people, with stories, with choices." Mr. Franklin had been silent for a long time, listening, absorbing, his thin hands resting around a warm mug someone had brought him. Finally, he spoke. "I used to think my life was small," he said. "I worked simple jobs, I lived in simple places, I lost people I loved. I thought when I left that neighborhood, my story ended. Tonight showed me something different. Tonight showed me that light doesn't belong to a moment. It belongs to a chain. One kindness becomes another kindness. One brave choice becomes another brave choice. I gave a lamp, Steve carried it, and tonight this boy," he looked at Jordan, "this boy became it." The words settled deep into the space between them. Jordan didn't shrink from them this time. He sat with them, letting them rest on his shoulders, not like a burden, but like a beginning. Steve reached for the faded photograph again, placing it gently in the center of the table. "This picture showed up tonight for a reason," he said. "It reminded me of where I came from. It reminded me of who I was before anyone knew my name. And now, I think it's reminding us of something else, that this promise we made tonight doesn't end when this night ends." He placed his hand over the photograph. Marjorie placed hers over his. Sandra followed. Then Keanu. Then Jordan. And finally, after a brief hesitation, Mr. Franklin rested his hand on top, his touch light but certain. They didn't speak the promise again. They didn't need to. The circle of hands said everything. Hours passed without anyone noticing. One by one, the younger children were carried inside, wrapped in blankets, kissed on foreheads, tucked into beds where they would later try to describe this night in pieces, never quite capturing all of it. But the core remained at the table, the ones who were still awake, the ones who felt that sleep would be a betrayal of what they were experiencing. They moved from the table to the porch, sitting in chairs and on steps, wrapped in sweaters and soft laughter. The sky had shifted, the black of night beginning to soften into deep blue. The stars seemed closer now, like distant candles answering the ones below. Steve sat beside Mr. Franklin, their shoulders nearly touching. "I wish my mother could have met you," Steve said quietly. "She used to tell me that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just knock." Mr. Franklin smiled faintly. "And sometimes," he said, "they open the door." Jordan sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, staring up at the sky. Keanu sat a little behind him, not crowding, not distant. Sandra sat nearby, her face lifted to the coming dawn. No one spoke for a while. The silence felt earned. Then Jordan broke it. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that something was wrong with me. That because I didn't know what I wanted to be or who I was supposed to be, it meant I didn't matter yet. Tonight, I don't feel like that anymore." Sandra turned toward him. "What do you feel?" Jordan searched for the words. "Like I don't have to become someone before I matter, like I already do." Steve smiled to himself. "That realization," he said, "is what takes some people a lifetime." Keanu's voice followed, low and thoughtful. "You don't find your place by becoming someone else. You find it by becoming more of who you already are." Jordan nodded, the words sinking in. He didn't know what he would do tomorrow or next year or in 10 years. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of not knowing. As the sky slowly began to change color, as dark gave way to deep violet and then to the first pale hints of gold, something else changed too. The night released them. Steve stood and stretched, looking out over his yard as if he were seeing it for the first time. "I invited y'all here for a day," he said quietly. "But what we lived through tonight, that's a lifetime memory." The first line of sunrise touched the horizon. Marjorie slipped her arm through Steve's. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, letting the light reach her face. Keanu watched the sky the way some people watch oceans, not as scenery, but as conversation. Mr. Franklin breathed deeply, his eyes moist, his expression peaceful. "This," he said softly, "is how nights like this are meant to end, not with sleep, with light." The sun rose slowly, deliberately, as if honoring the promise it had been hearing all night. Gold spilled across the rooftops, over the trees, across the faces of people who had been strangers to one another's deepest truths only hours earlier. Jordan felt the warmth touch his skin and something in his chest loosened. He turned to Keanu. "Thank you," he said, "for sitting with me, for taking me into the dark, for believing I could help." Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't need someone to make you capable. You only need someone to remind you that you are." Jordan absorbed that. He didn't argue, he didn't deflect, he accepted it. Sandra stood and stretched her arms toward the sky. "Every sunrise feels different," she said, "but this one feels like a beginning." Steve looked around at all of them. "Then let's treat it like one." They stood together, watching the sun climb higher, knowing that soon the world would return, phones would buzz, schedules would matter, names would carry weight again. But none of that could touch what had been planted in this backyard. Because what had happened here was not an event. It was a transfer of memory, of courage, of light. And though the night had finally ended, every one of them knew the story of it had not. Not yet. The morning unfolded slowly, like the careful opening of a letter written by life itself. The sky above Steve Harvey's home had fully surrendered to gold and pale blue, the kind of gentle light that doesn't rush anyone into being awake, but quietly invites the world back into motion. Birds stirred in the trees, distant traffic whispered back into existence, and somewhere inside the house, a clock chimed softly, reminding them that time had never actually stopped. Yet for everyone still standing on the porch, wrapped in the warmth of that sunrise, it felt as if something timeless had settled among them, something that could not be measured in hours. No one moved right away. Steve leaned against the porch rail, his arm still around Marjorie, his gaze unfocused as if he were looking not at the sky but through it, into the many versions of himself that had led him here. Sandra rested her hands on the back of a chair, breathing in the cool morning air, her expression peaceful in a way cameras rarely caught. Keanu remained still, shoulders relaxed, eyes reflecting the light like a quiet lake. Mr. Franklin sat slightly apart, wrapped in a blanket, his face lifted to the sun, lips parted in a faint smile. Jordan stood near the steps, unsure whether to sit or move or speak, feeling as if he were standing on the edge of something new that did not yet have a name. Eventually, Marjorie broke the silence. "Everyone must be starving," she said softly, though there was a smile in her voice. Sunrise always makes me hungry. The words felt like permission. Slowly, gently, they began to shift back into motion, not leaving the moment behind, but carrying it with them. Coffee was poured, bread was warmed, someone found fruit in the kitchen. The simple sounds of morning filled the house, grounding what had felt almost dreamlike. They gathered again at the table, but now the table belonged to morning. Plates were set. Steam rose from cups. The candles, burned low, were finally extinguished, their thin trails of smoke twisting into the new light like quiet goodbyes to the night. The faded photograph remained at the center, but now it looked different, less like a memory, more like a foundation. Steve watched his family move, watched the ease with which Sandra helped Marjorie, watched the way Keanu wordlessly handed plates to the younger kids who had begun to wander back out with sleep in their eyes, watched Jordan take responsibility without being asked. Something about it all tightened his chest. He cleared his throat. "You know," he said slowly, "people ask me all the time what success feels like. They think it's numbers or applause or the size of a room. But if anybody asked me today, I'd say it feels like this." Marjorie looked at him. "What?" "Being awake with the people who matter," he said. "Knowing why you're standing where you're standing." Jordan glanced up from where he was pouring juice for one of the younger children. "I never knew mornings could feel like this," he said. "Usually they just feel like pressure." Sandra smiled gently. "They feel like that when you're running from something," she said. "They feel like this when you're moving towards something." The words stayed with Jordan, moving towards something, not escaping, not hiding, moving. After breakfast, when the dishes were cleared and the house settled into that late-morning calm, Steve suggested a walk. "There's a small park down the street," he said. "Nothing special, but after a night like this, I don't want to sit inside." Everyone agreed. Mr. Franklin was helped gently to his feet, leaning on Steve's arm, and together they stepped out into a world that had no idea what had been born in that backyard. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in morning light, ordinary in a way that suddenly felt sacred. They walked slowly, not as a group of celebrities or guests, but as people who had shared something and were now protecting it simply by staying close. Children ran ahead. Marjorie and Sandra spoke quietly. Steve and Mr. Franklin walked side by side. Keanu stayed near Jordan, not because he needed to, but because Jordan no longer needed to be alone. They reached the small park, where dew still clung to the grass and a few early walkers nodded in passing, unaware of the invisible thread connecting the group. They found a bench beneath a tree, its leaves whispering softly in the breeze. Mr. Franklin sat down carefully, breathing a little heavier now, though he waved away concern with a small motion of his hand. "This place reminds me of the park near my old house," he said. "I used to take my wife there before she got sick. We'd sit just like this. No plans, just time." Steve sat beside him. "Tell us about her," he said. Mr. Franklin's eyes softened. "Her name was Ruth. She had a laugh that started quiet and ended like thunder. She believed people were better than their worst days. She believed that even when we didn't have much, we were rich in moments." He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "She's the one who made me carry that lamp that night. I was tired. I didn't want to go out. She said, 'Someone needs us.' She was almost always right." Sandra felt tears gather again, uninvited but welcome. "She sounds like someone who understood light," she said. "She was light," Mr. Franklin replied simply. Jordan listened as if every word were a map. He had never met Ruth, but he felt as if he knew her, as if her kindness had somehow reached him through Steve, through Keanu, through the night, through a boy gasping for breath, through a photograph, through a lamp that no longer existed except in story. After a while, Mr. Franklin shifted uncomfortably. Steve noticed immediately. "You all right?" he asked. Mr. Franklin nodded, but the nod was slow. "Just a little tired." Keanu knelt in front of him, his voice low. "Do you want to go back to the house?" Mr. Franklin considered it, then shook his head. "No, I'd like to stay here a moment." They sat in companionable silence, but Jordan watched closely now. Something in the way Mr. Franklin's breathing had changed stirred concern in him. He didn't know why he felt it, only that he did. "Mr. Franklin," Jordan said softly, "are you sure you're okay?" The old man looked at him, really looked at him, as if memorizing his face. "I'm okay," he said gently, "and if I were, I would be." Jordan didn't understand the words, but they made his chest ache. They stayed in the park longer than they had planned, letting the morning settle into them. When they finally stood to return, Mr. Franklin leaned more heavily on Steve's arm. Halfway back, he stopped. His breath caught, just for a second, but it was enough. Keanu was beside him instantly. Sandra stepped forward. Steve felt the shift before anyone said anything. "I think I need to sit," Mr. Franklin whispered. They guided him to a low wall and eased him down. Steve knelt in front of him, fear rising now no longer subtle. "Talk to me," he said. "What's happening?" Mr. Franklin smiled faintly. I think I've walked far enough." Sandra's hand flew to her mouth. Keanu reached for his phone. Jordan stood frozen, every word of the night screaming through him at once. "Mr. Franklin," Steve said, his voice breaking, "stay with me. Stay with me, man." Keanu spoke calmly, already calling for help, his voice steady, clear, grounding the panic. Sandra took Mr. Franklin's other hand, rubbing it gently, speaking softly. "You're not alone," she said. "We're here." Mr. Franklin's gaze moved slowly, resting on each of them. "I didn't think I'd see the end of that story," he said quietly. "I thought the lamp would be my last chapter, but this," he looked at Jordan, "this is a beautiful ending." Jordan dropped to his knees without realizing he had moved. "You can't go," he said, the words tearing out of him. "You still have light." Mr. Franklin smiled at him, a smile so full of peace it hurt. "Light doesn't disappear," he said. "It changes hands." Sirens grew in the distance, but the moment felt suspended beyond sound. Steve pressed his forehead to Mr. Franklin's. "You changed my life," he whispered. "You changed all of ours." Mr. Franklin exhaled slowly. Then it was enough. His eyes closed gently, and something in the morning air changed. The paramedics arrived quickly. Movements were practiced. Voices were professional, but the life that had walked into Steve Harvey's house the night before had already begun to slip somewhere beyond hands and instruments. They worked. They tried. They respected. But some moments are not meant to be reversed. When it was over, the park felt impossibly quiet. Sandra sat on the low wall, unable to stand. Steve remained kneeling, hands empty now, as if he could not yet understand that the weight he had been holding was no longer there. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort him out of the moment, but to keep him from being alone inside it. Jordan stood very still, tears streaming freely, not wiping them away, not hiding them. He had known Mr. Franklin for less than a day. And yet it felt like he had lost a grandfather. Someone who had seen him. Someone who had chosen him. Someone who had passed him something invisible and enormous. They walked back slowly. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The house came back into view, the same house where laughter had filled the air, where stories had been told, where light had been promised. Now it held something else too. Legacy. And Jordan, walking between Keanu and Sandra, understood something he had never understood before. That some people enter your life not to stay, but to leave you changed forever. And as heavy as his heart felt, it was not empty. It was full. Of responsibility, of meaning, of light. The walk back to the house felt longer than the walk to the park, not because the distance had changed, but because every step now carried the weight of what they had just witnessed. The street was still bathed in morning light, neighbors still tending gardens, birds still moving from branch to branch, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet for the small group moving slowly together, the world had shifted in a way that could never be undone. Steve walked at the center, shoulders heavier, hands curled into quiet fists. Sandra stayed close, her presence steady, protective without trying to fix what could not be fixed. Keanu walked slightly behind, eyes lowered, carrying the kind of silence that honors grief rather than escaping it. And Jordan walked between them, his face wet with tears he did not bother to hide, his chest tight not only with sadness, but with something deeper and more complicated, something that felt like responsibility. When they reached the house, the doors were already open, Marjorie standing in the doorway as if she had sensed the change before she saw it. The moment she looked at Steve's face, she knew. Her hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching sharply as she crossed the space between them. Steve did not speak. He simply shook his head once. Marjorie wrapped her arms around him, holding him the way she had held him through every difficult season of their life. And this time he let himself lean into her fully, not as a host, not as a public figure, but as the boy who had once sat in the dark waiting for a lamp that changed everything. Inside, the house grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before. This quiet carried reverence. It carried memory. It carried the understanding that something holy in the human sense of the word had passed through them. They gathered once more in the living room, sunlight pouring in through the windows, touching the walls where family photographs hung, now joined invisibly by the face of a man who had never been there before but would never truly leave. Steve sank onto the couch, staring at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. "He came back," he whispered. "After all these years, he came back, and then he left again." His voice broke. "It feels like the night he first walked out of my life all over again." Sandra sat beside him, her voice gentle but grounded. "This time," she said, "he didn't leave in the dark. He left surrounded by the light he started." Keanu remained standing for a moment, then slowly sat on the arm of a nearby chair, his presence unintrusive but strong. "Some people," he said quietly, "don't stay long because their purpose isn't time, it's direction." Jordan stood near the doorway, unsure where he belonged now that the night had ended and something else had begun. He felt like the world had asked him a question and he was still searching for the words to answer it. Marjorie noticed him, the way a mother notices a child even when everyone else is speaking. She held out her hand. "Come here," she said softly. Jordan hesitated, then crossed the room and sat on the floor near her knees, resting his arms on the couch. Marjorie placed her hand gently on his head. "You were with him at the end," she said. "How are you holding up?" Jordan swallowed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I only knew him for a few hours, but it feels like he gave me something I don't know how to hold." Steve looked at him then, really looked at him, and his voice softened. "That's because he didn't give you something to hold," he said. "He gave you something to become." Jordan's eyes filled again. "He said the light changes hands," he whispered. "Yes," Steve replied, "and he chose yours." Those words landed heavily, not as praise but as calling. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly. Some family members arrived after hearing the news, drawn not by headlines but by heart. Coffee was reheated. Blankets were brought out. Conversations were low, filled with reflection more than shock. Steve called the authorities, answering questions with respect and gratitude. The world outside began to learn that an elderly man had passed peacefully, but inside the house they were not discussing death. They were discussing meaning. At one point, Steve rose and walked toward the table where the faded photograph still rested. He picked it up carefully, studying it again as if now seeing something new in it. Then he turned to Jordan. "Come with me," he said. Jordan stood and followed him into a smaller room at the back of the house, a room Steve rarely used, where old awards, letters, and photographs were kept. Steve opened a drawer and pulled out a simple wooden box. He placed the photograph inside, then closed the lid. "This belongs to the family," he said, "but I don't want it hidden. I want it where it can remind us." He paused, then extended the box toward Jordan. "And I want you to be the one to decide where that is." Jordan stared at the box, startled. "Me?" Steve nodded. "Because last night you were searching for belonging. Today you're part of a legacy, and legacies don't stay on shelves, they move." Jordan took the box with both hands, his grip careful, his heart pounding. He looked up unsure. "I don't know what to do with it." Steve smiled through his grief. "You will." They returned to the living room where Sandra and Keanu sat together, speaking quietly. When they saw Jordan holding the box, both of them understood without being told. Sandra stood and approached him. "What are you feeling right now?" she asked gently. Jordan searched for the truth. "Sad," he said, "but also awake." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's what purpose feels like at first," he said, "heavy and bright at the same time." Later, when the house began to empty and the day moved forward, Steve walked Keanu and Sandra to the front door. The morning had grown warmer. The neighborhood was fully awake now. It felt almost unreal that somewhere only hours ago, the world had tilted. Steve stopped before opening the door. "You two didn't just come for a visit," he said. "You came for a moment, and moments like this, they don't happen by accident." Sandra embraced him, holding him with a tenderness that spoke of shared humanity rather than shared status. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting us with something this real." Keanu shook Steve's hand, then surprised him by pulling him into a firm, silent hug. Steve held on longer than expected. "You helped remind a boy who he is," Steve said quietly. "That's not something I'll ever forget." Keanu glanced toward Jordan, who stood a few steps back, holding the wooden box. "He reminded himself," Keanu replied. Before they left, Jordan stepped forward. His voice trembled, but his eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said to both of them, "for yesterday, for last night, for all of it." Sandra smiled at him, brushing his arm. "We didn't change you," she said. "We just met you at the moment you were ready." Keanu held his gaze a second longer. "Whatever you do next," he said, "do it like light, not loud, not for praise, just real." Jordan nodded. He didn't promise, he didn't need to. Something had already been promised in him. After they drove away, the house felt larger but not emptier. Steve stood in the doorway beside Marjorie, watching the street, then turned toward Jordan. "What are you going to do today?" he asked. Jordan thought for a long moment, then he lifted the box slightly. "I want to go see the community center near my school," he said. "They do after-school programs. There are kids there who feel like I did." He hesitated. "I don't know what I can offer yet, but I can start showing up." Steve felt his eyes burn again, but this time the tears were different. "That," he said, "is exactly how Mr. Franklin lived." Jordan took a breath, then another, and stepped forward into the day. Weeks later, a small corner appeared inside the community center. It held a framed photograph of a little house lit by a lamp, a simple plaque that read, "Every act of light returns," and a shelf of donated books. Jordan volunteered there after school. Sometimes he helped with homework. Sometimes he just listened. Sometimes he sat quietly with kids who didn't know how to speak yet. He didn't tell them about Steve Harvey. He didn't tell them about Keanu Reeves or Sandra Bullock. He didn't tell them about fame or tragedy or extraordinary nights. He told them about light, about how it shows up when you don't expect it, about how it moves through people, about how it waits for hands willing to carry it. And on a warm afternoon months later, when Jordan watched a younger boy calm down simply because someone had sat beside him, he felt something settle into place. He finally understood what Mr. Franklin had meant. Light does not disappear. It continues. And sometimes, it begins with nothing more than a quiet choice to sit with someone in the dark. That was the legacy of that special day. Not a story about celebrities. Not a story about coincidence. But a story about how kindness moves from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. And always, inevitably, returns